Good. Good morning. God bless you. Welcome to Living Well, our live stream studio. As the video ended, it said, "Who is like the Lord?" No one, absolutely no one. So today we're going to learn some more about the Lord here in our adult small groups. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 32. We're continuing with the story of Jacob. Jacob and Esau. I hope your week went well. We do in the PowerPoints that rotates and shows the different numbers and things that you can call. If you have any prayer requests, I realize life is complicated at times, it's messy, we get at our wits' end, we need help. Feel free to call those numbers. Feel free to contact us for prayer requests. Those are all listed for you, and you'll see them in different places. Along with the Living Well website, Facebook page, and then again in the PowerPoint as it goes around. So as we get started today, open your Bibles again to Genesis 32, and we'll pray and invite the Lord and the Holy Spirit here to help us with our study this morning. Mighty God, our Holy Father in heaven, thank you once again for being you. No one is like you. Nothing can compare. So with that in mind, God, our holy, mighty Father, please meet us here. Initiate the conversation with our spirit. If our faith is lacking, please bolster us. Help us to think, to be what we need to think and do and be to become more like your Son. So as we continue forward with this, Holy Spirit, please rest mightily upon us. Guide us, the great counselor, educator, and friend. And please help us to get out of these words, these inspired words today, what we need to get out of them. To again, become more like Jesus Christ. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Yeah, so today this is about the power grab part 2. We did the power grab part 1 before. We're talking about Jacob and Esau, and Jacob sneaking in with the food and deceiving. We talked about deceiving and lying last week. And remember, does the Bible say that you are to deceive? Is that a good thing? And of course, nowhere in the Bible does it tell you to deceive. Even if you're telling truths with the intent to hide truths, the Bible doesn't really condone that. Now, having said that, we do have a sign over to the side that says, birthday donut, their calories don't count. So we're not trying to deceive anybody, but we're inviting people to eat some Tracy Young birthday donuts this morning. It's their birthday. But with that in mind, we're not trying to deceive anybody, because I'm sure they do count somewhere. But it says, donut resist, take one. Birthday donuts, their calories don't count. Okay. Moving on. Today they want to start out asking, have you ever thought about changing your name? Most people probably would say no, but when you were little you wanted to change your name? Oh yeah, like a princess name. Tracy isn't a princess name? Okay. I could ask Brother Dan about that, if Tracy's a princess name. Anyway, or Shelley, is that a princess name? Is Pam a princess name? Nancy, is that a princess name? But, or Tina, is that a princess name? No, I see a lot of no's. So I guess you're correct in that maybe they might have wanted to change it too at some point. It says, what might cause a person to consider changing their name? They're on the lam. They're hiding from the man. What do you think, Brother Jay? That's true. People can't pronounce it right. I'm going to move forward and bring them a mic too. I have met foreigners. One, for example, his name was Al Nazir Ladha. He changed his name to Al, first name, and then Nazir, last name. It was more Americanized. It was easier for people to pronounce. But if he had to explain his name as Al Nazir Ladha, people would be like, well. So yeah, if they're foreign, especially coming into the U.S., the name is hard to pronounce. As Tracy said, they're on the lam. They're hiding from their past or from somebody. And ask the question, if you could change your name, would you? And if so, what would it be? I don't know. A lot of us are probably pretty comfortable with our names at this point. Ladies do change their last name on tradition when they get married. So there is a name change in a sense there. But most people, by the time they get to adulthood, they're settled in. Even if you're a boy named Sue, you're settled in and you just deal with what you got. Not everybody, but a lot of people. So to ask the question, what notable Bible characters have been given new names? And it's not a quiz, but can you think of anybody in the Bible that's been given a new name? Paul, yeah. Saul to Paul. Yeah, Peter's a good one. Yeah, he became the rock. Was it Bocephus? Or Cephas? How about Abraham? Yeah, Abraham. It's Sarah. Sarah. So people have had their names changed in the past. So today, we're going to look at a divine encounter that changed Jacob's character in such a dynamic way that it necessitated God to change his name. So remember, Jacob became Israel. All right, let's go ahead and continue. It says some of the background chapters we looked at last week. What were the events that led to the ruptured relationship between Jacob and Esau? What are some of the events that have led up? What have we talked about last week that led up to today's, the ruptured relationship between the two? Any thoughts on that? I don't know, were you here last week, Tracy? Uh-oh, she gets a little bit of an excuse. Well, we talked about Esau coming in hungry from the field and famished and tired. Remember, he sold his birthright for some stew. He thought he was just in his exasperation. He didn't take any, thought it was very important, didn't put any weight on it. But God looks at the heart, the spirit of the matter, and that was a serious thing. So I suppose that would lead one to be mindful and careful what you say, even if you think it might not be very weighty or something it could be to somebody else, especially God. And of course, Jacob deceiving Isaac and giving him Esau's birthright. That was the ender there. Because then Jacob had to flee, remember, for his life. And he had to go over to, was it Laban's place? So it says, despite having both the birthright and the blessing, how did Jacob forfeit a life of peace? Because if you understand the story a little bit, he had to flee, just like we said, flee for his life. Esau was so upset, they were afraid he would do a Cain and Abel thing. So having both the birthright and the blessing, how did Jacob forfeit a life of peace?
He got it under dubious manner, so I mean there's consequences to that. If he'd gotten it through mean, if it was rightfully his, he wouldn't have had to run.
Yep. And that's a good point. If you do things righteously and rightfully, you can stand up and say, yes, this is mine, I did this. But when you do things in a sneaky fashion, in a dubious, insidious, sneaky fashion, you can't stand up and say, yeah, that's mine. God bless you. Yeah, she's allergic to the scriptures this morning. Yeah, because first off, he did have to flee the wrath of Esau. And Esau became a very powerful man, had great influence, could really reach out. So he was in exile from his brother, hiding out. He had to leave his home, like Abraham left his family. He had to leave his family. He was fortunate enough to have some extended family out there that took him in. But he had to leave his mother and his father. And of course, retelling this story to his kids or anybody else, who'd want to admit that they tricked their grandpa and given them the birthright, that he wasn't exactly an honorable guy. So he had forfeited quite a bit with this deception. Now it says the irony of these intervening chapters of Genesis is that the tables were turned on Jacob, and of course he was called the deceiver, Jacob the deceiver. So it asks the question, how do his victories of birthright and blessing that were won through illegitimate means, how do they bring Jacob a new taste of defeat? Do you guys recall the story at all? They didn't get into this a little bit. You kind of have to know some of the Bible for this part. So I apologize. We'll explain it in a bit online if you're not familiar with this as much. But how did this illegitimately getting this stuff, these blessings, how did that give him a life of defeat? The tables were turned on him. He had a new taste of defeat. What happened out at his uncle's place, at Laban's place? Do you remember any of that? Do you guys remember a girl named Rachel? Okay, go ahead, Miss Nancy.
Laban had a considerable sized family, but two daughters in particular. And he thought that he was working to get the bride of the one that he loved. And his uncle tricked him and he got the other one. He ended up marrying both of them, but he was caught in a trap of deceit himself.
Well said. The deceiver became deceived himself. He fell in love with Rachel, the younger daughter. She was younger than Leah. And as our sister Nancy said, he worked 7 years for his uncle, for Laban, for the rightful hand in marriage that they agreed upon. And the wedding day came. His beautiful bride was in a veil. He got married to her, left with the veil still on. And come to find out, he had married the older sister because his uncle wasn't about to let the younger sister marry before the older sister. So he had to work 7 more years to be able to win her hand in marriage. So he worked 14 years for Rachel. Must have really wanted her hand in marriage. We'll just say that. But the point is, the deceiver was being deceived. There are even the stories of the sheep, the flock, how there began to be so many of them, they decided to split the flock. And remember, Laban said, you can take the ones that, if I remember right, had spots or something on them. But the deceiver, Jacob, was so astute, he realized the genetic patterns. So when he had the sheep bred, or when he allowed them to breed, he made sure it was in such a way that he would get the desired results, and he was still getting the majority of the sheep. Remember that? And Laban was mad about that. So they were always going back and forth, trying to trick the other one, trying to get the upper hand. And when you live a life of deception, that's what happens. You may think you got away with something now, but you're going to be on the other end of it before you know it. And then you're going to be like, what? Because then you got taken. That's not a way to live. Yep. So it's our first reading today is Genesis chapter 32, verses 22 through 26. If I have a volunteer. Genesis chapter 32, verse 22 through 26. Oh, Mr. Mark.
That night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. The man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me."
Thank you. So this was part of a plan. We're continuing with the story. Here, he wants to go back home to his homeland. He's bringing his wives and possessions with him. And he finds out that Esau is on the way to meet him with a mighty force, a lot of men. And he knows he's defenseless, in a sense, that they could just rout every bit of them easily and have their way with all his possessions, kill him and anybody they wanted to. So he devises this plan. Since it's me they want, I'll send everything on ahead, get everything out of harm's way in a sense, and then I'll just meet him. So this was part of a plan he had worked out when he sent the wives across and the maidservants and the flocks and all the stuff. He was getting everything, in a sense, out of harm's way because he knew he was the one that had brought the wrath down on his brother, or upon himself from his brother. So that's the setting for this. And of course, then while he was there, he was by himself now, some time to think, evidently, fell asleep, and then got up and was wrestling with a man, as it says at first. With a man. And that's where the story continues there. Wrestle till daybreak. So it asks a question, did Jacob realize he was placing himself in a position for an encounter with God? Why or why not? First off, do you think he even realized he was placing himself in for an encounter with God? I'll give you a hint. It's kind of no. And why do you think that is? What actions was he taking that lead you in an indication that he wasn't depending on God or anticipating this type of encounter with God?
He sent everything else ahead and stayed back.
Yeah, he was still doing things carnally. Now, of course, that can make sense. I'm a great strategist. I could study things and see all kinds of angles and everything. That was a good strategy, but it wasn't done again with the trust of the Lord and his might and his strength, depending upon God. He was still using his own power, his own skills, his own cunning. Hadn't asked God for help at this point, the Bible doesn't indicate. So when he went to sleep, he was deeply troubled. He'd done everything that he himself could personally do. And it was then that the encounter happened. He had nothing else left but God. Nothing else. He'd done everything. He was at the mercy of every other part of the situation. he was done. He was undone. So it asks the question, who is the man, quote unquote, who wrestled with Jacob? Who was the man that wrestled with Jacob? And how do we know this? Now, this is a little tricky because some, what do you call them, interpretations of the Bible will say he wrestled with an angel, and some will say he wrestled with God. Now, whether it was a messenger of God, an angel of God, or Jesus, or God himself, we know this was a representative of God at least. This was some form of something higher than himself. And if you recall, the other man, the other being, knew Jacob's name, knew who he was. It wasn't like it was just somebody running around in the sand out there, whatever the terrain was like, and just ran up upon Jacob and started wrestling with him. This person knew who he was, called him by name, this individual. So we do know at least it was a representative of God, and more than likely, as a lot of people believe, this was Jesus in the form of man wrestling with Jacob. Now, to ask the question, this is interesting. Did God wrestle with Jacob, or did Jacob wrestle with God? And what's the difference? This is a pretty good one. Did God wrestle with Jacob, or did Jacob wrestle with God? Well, what's the difference? Why? How can you tell? Yeah, that's a good one. But really, if you get it down to its most basic form, it's actually pretty simple. Can anything wrestle with God? It's a smackdown. Is God almighty? Is God all powerful? Do you think anything can contend him? Can anything wrestle with him? Can anything oppose him? Answer is no, 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 no. So when you wrestle with God, you're really wrestling with yourself in the relationship with God. But to actually wrestle God, there's just no. So in a sense, it says, did God wrestle with Jacob, or did Jacob wrestle with God? God didn't wrestle with Jacob because he's the Almighty, but Jacob wrestled with God, with their relationship and the authority being subject to him. But as far as divinity, nothing can wrestle with God, and God doesn't need to wrestle with anything. He just says, that's the way it is. But God is a gentleman. It does ask, who instigated this encounter? Any thoughts on that? Who instigated this encounter?
God, because Jacob was alone.
Yep. And it does say, using verbiage, that a man wrestled with Jacob. The man came up upon Jacob. God initiated the encounter. It says, bringing Jacob from self-sufficiency and just depending on me, in line with being dependent upon God. That was the whole reason for this encounter. But verse 28 says that Jacob in turn wrestled with God. This was a lifelong pattern of dependence on his own strength, cunning, and ingenuity. It says God could have overcome Jacob with divine power at any time, but he desired submission from Jacob. So it asks the question, what is significant about the duration of the encounter? How long did this thing last? Yeah, all night, didn't it? Till daybreak. This thing lasted a while. How long can we wrestle with God over things? A long time, can't we? Instead of getting it like we're supposed to. And we're supposed to lead others to Christ. But if you're still wrestling with God over trying to do things your way and not doing things His way, I heard it said over the weekend, you cannot lead someone to where you are not when it comes to God. If you are not in the right relationship with Jesus Christ, if you're wrestling with God and not being submissive, trying to do things your own way, still locked in some form of sin, you can't lead people truly to Christ if you're not by Him to start with Him. Now, this is opposite of what the world would say, because to lead somebody somewhere, you have to leave that spot and go get them. But we're talking spiritually here. There's always, anytime you talk about divinity, it's special. You need to be beside Christ to lead somebody to Him. You cannot lead someone to where you are not at when it comes to Christ. So Jacob is wrestling all night long. It lasted all night. Jacob was insistently stubborn against God. He was insistently stubborn. It says only after hours of trying to be self-sufficient and struggling with that, and then a resulting injury, did Jacob submit and ask for a blessing. How many times do we do that? We have to wait for an injury, for an affliction, for something horrible, something absolutely beyond our control. Not that anything's truly in our control anyway, but we have to wait for the tsunami, whatever it is, to rush right over you and engulf you before you finally submit. Unfortunately, that's all too common. It says, if God is all-powerful, why could He not overcome Jacob or overpower him? Because if you read that, it says He could not overpower him. When the man saw that he could not overpower Jacob, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man.
Free will.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Yep, absolutely. God was not struggling against Jacob's strength as a man, his muscle and sinew. He was wrestling against his will, his obedience. And God is a gentleman. He doesn't want a robot. He wants you to follow Him of your own free will. So all night long, they were wrestling. And this means more than just physically, obviously. But Jacob wouldn't give up until he touched him. And as they say, his hip went out of socket. He injured his hip in whatever form that looked like. It says God was not struggling with Jacob's physical strength or endurance, but rather with his lifelong self-reliance on himself, his own wit, his own stubbornness, and his own cunning. It says God does not want to overpower us with our will. He wants us to submit lovingly to His guidance. But Jacob wouldn't stop, and he touched him. It says, when God touched the socket of Jacob's hip, what does this indicate about God's sovereignty and our humanity? What does that say about us and God, His sovereignty and our humanity, if all He had to do is reach down and go, touch it? And it immediately gave way. What does that say about God and His sovereignty and us and our humanity? Yep. Who's the boss? God. Who responds to the boss? Really everything. All of creation. He touched a created part and it responded. All of creation responds to God. Those little animals running around out there still doing their jobs. The birds get up and sing. They run around, scurry, get their food. They play if they can. It's people that get up most of the time and aren't doing their jobs. But all of humanity responds to God's touch. God is sovereign, the Almighty. Okay, our next reading is Genesis 32, verses 27 through 32. This is the only other part. There's only 2 readings today. Verses 27 through 32. If I have a volunteer for that. I see Miss Tracy reaching.
The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place, how do you say that?
That place. Peniel.
Peniel,
Peniel.
saying, "It is because I saw God's face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon.
So it asks a question to start with. What did Jacob mean, the name Jacob? We've talked about this. What did the name Jacob mean? Yep, deceiver. And now, what does the name Israel mean? I'll just tell you, because a lot of times we don't get into a lot of this part of it. It's more important that you understand the meanings behind things and just be able to just throw this stuff out, verses by rote and everything else. The important thing is the application of it. So Jacob means deceiver. Israel means he struggles with God. So you have deceiver, and then he struggles with God. So what is the significance of God changing his name? Yeah, what's the significance between the 2 names? The definitions, the 2 different definitions, and God changing his name from deceiver to he struggles with God. What's the significance there? What can you think of? What would be significant about that? Because in reality, none of us, we have done it, but none of us should be Jacobs. We all should be Israels. And even better, but at least Israels. A deceiver, remember, is someone who is hiding the truth, even with other truths, shrouding and hiding it, or just flat out lies. A person should not be, in a sense, a Jacob, a deceiver. But an Israel means that you're not deceiving anymore. You're not lying, you're not hiding things. You still struggle. You still wonder and ask and struggle at times. And don't we all do that? I struggle to understand at times God's will. Even though I can see it right in front of me, I'll say, well, why'd you allow that? Or why did you not do this? Or why did you do that or allow it? So at times, and of course later then you can see with better clarity what the benefit was. But at the time, we all struggle at times. We're all kind of an Israel at times. But that's a major difference. That's significant that God changed his name. So what do you think that means about Jacob now? His heart. He went, and God saw this, and God doesn't make mistakes. God went from calling him Jacob to Israel. So what does it say about Jacob's heart now? What is he going to do in the future? What change has taken place? Any thoughts on that? What is he not going to do? He had his name changed from it. Yeah. He's done with the deceiving. He's done with just flat out trying to do everything himself in his own strength, by his own cunning, his own wits. He still might struggle with God at times, but he's done with the deception. How many times do we do that? Act like we've got it all together when everything's fallen apart. You're struggling with a particular sin or a particular affliction. Someone will even step up and ask you, a good Christian brother or sister, are you all right? What's your pat answer? Oh yeah, I'm fine. I'm good. God just sent you a rowboat. He sent you away off the island, wherever you're stranded at. Take the rowboat. Brother, you look like you have a need. Is there any way I can help you at all? No, I'm fine. I'm all right. Yep, that arm, it'll reattach itself. I don't need any help. So he's not a deceiver anymore. He still wrestles with God from time to time. But now his will, he has bent it to God's will. He's not going to try to do it his way anymore. Even if he doesn't understand, and he can struggle at times, inside in his heart, he's decided, how can I wrestle against God? How can I do this? Of course, it finally took that touch, that affliction, wrestled with him all night long, didn't he? That touch. So to ask the question, when Jacob asked the man his name, how does this show his lack of spiritual perception? He still didn't quite get it yet. How did that show his lack of spiritual perception? What's your name? And of course, God's reply, why do you ask my name? What does that indicate? Why do you ask my name? This has been said before in the Bible when someone asked the Lord who he was. Do I? Yep. Yeah, he was having doubts. He didn't truly recognize that it was God, that it was, in a sense, he should have known. As we said, somebody just doesn't run up out of creation itself and know your name immediately, generally. That's usually divinely originated. Wrestling all night, touching his hip. But he asked God his name, and God says, why do you ask me my name? Don't you know? Yeah, it indicates Jacob's need for a divine encounter, that he needed to recognize God, that he needed this if he was going to do the right thing and bend and submit. So to ask, at what point did Jacob realize that he had been wrestling with God? He still didn't completely quite get it, even with the hip all jacked up.
It was after the blessing.
Yes. Yep, after the blessing. When the good Lord spoke with his authority and said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans, and you have overcome. He blessed him. That's when he realized finally. So even after the affliction, a lot of times, how many times do we forget? Do we go through an affliction? It can even be life-threatening, life-altering, almost life-ending. And we forget the depth, the gravity of it, that which we should know and remember, what God has done for you, either directly himself divinely or through others. Yep, he didn't realize until the blessing. And then he's like, oh. It says when the blessing came, it was obvious. And of course, the good Lord allowed this because he wanted it to be obvious. Jacob needed this. He'll give you what you need. So to ask the question, why did God leave Jacob with a lifelong limp? He could have just fixed it again right on the spot.
As a reminder.
Absolutely. Didn't I just ask, how many times do we have a thing that can even be life-threatening, life-altering? But sometimes he'll leave a limp, a slight affliction. To you, it still might seem major, but he'll leave an affliction for a reminder that as you go through this daily affliction, whatever it is, a knee wrecked by football, why, Lord, why me? Anything under the sun that he leaves and doesn't completely heal, a lot of times is a reminder of his glory and majesty and what he's doing in your life. You just have to ask the Spirit to reveal it to you, to help you understand it. So a lot of times we're kind of blind to it. But he left him with a lifelong limping disability, and it served as a reminder of Jacob's divine encounter. So how many times later on do we think back and go, did that really happen? That wasn't that big of a deal. I think I did pretty good. I did a lot of it myself. And you forget. It says, we may never have an encounter with God like Jacob, but we must always keep in mind that encountering God comes in many shapes and forms. So to ask the question, why is it so important sometimes, or even necessary, to be in solitude to have an encounter with God? Why is it a lot of times when it's in a quiet moment, or in a moment when you're just thinking about Him? You could even be surrounded by people, but you're not paying any attention to that. You're completely focused on the good Lord. You're, in a sense, in solitude. Why is it a lot of times solitude is necessary for an encounter with God? Why do you think that is? And of course, the second question kind of answers the first. Why is it so difficult to achieve solitude in our culture? Yeah. The solitude, generally you're more reflective. You're focusing on God, and you're getting more to the root of things. God shows up a lot of times when you're focused on Him. It's a teachable moment. It could be a divine moment. It's hard to find these in today's culture where you have noise constantly. Things continuously turned on, making noise. We're always engaged in activities. A lot of us, if we sit down and do nothing for a moment, you almost feel guilty. Like there's something I'm supposed to be doing, but I'm not doing it.
I was thinking about, at night here, when you look at the sky, you see the stars, but there's so many more stars that we don't see because of the light pollution.
Yep.
And He wants to meet us in the darkness where we see all the stars.
Yeah. Yeah, the world has its screaming voice in there, doesn't it? It's hard to focus on the good Lord, like the light pollution. All the other things to focus upon, all the other quote-unquote noises and lights. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have a divine moment. As I said, even in the midst of a crowd, if you're quiet inside and you're focusing on God, just in complete worship, that has happened. Of course, that happened to me at the last district assembly. And I was in a crowd of people. We were all singing, enjoying, but I was worshiping. And I was really, I haven't worshiped that deep in a while. I was really into it. And just a big dumb grin on my face. And I looked over at some other people. I don't remember where they were from. I could say Nigeria. But I don't know if they even spoke English very well or not. But we looked at each other and we just had the biggest, dumbest grins on our face. We were doing the same thing, worshiping Jesus. and I was in complete communion with them. And it was in that moment, when I was completely focused on God, that he spoke into my heart, into my mind. He spoke to me. So again, it was a form of solitude. Of course, I was around everybody, but I was completely focused on God. So to ask the question, failure to submit to God sooner resulted in a lifelong limp for Jacob. Do you think God or Jacob could have avoided this limp? Yes, if he'd quit trying to do everything in his own strength and his own cunning and his own deceit. Yes, likely he could have avoided that. So to ask the question, how do poor choices leave marks on our lives? By marks, I don't mean like a name. Poor choices can leave scars and lasting effects. So how do your choices leave scars and lasting effects in your life? Poor choices, how do they leave scars on your life? This is interesting. Those poor choices can cause hurt. Go ahead, brother. Were you going to say something?
I was thinking that poor choices have consequences,
Mm-hmm.
and once we make that poor choice, we can't always reel it back in. I mean, maybe parts of it, but the damage that's done there, things we do affect other people, and we can't always change. We can't change what we did to those people, and we can't change how they react.
Yep. And when you heal from something, it leaves a scar. You see it on your skin. It's the most external organ. Your skin is an organ, just like your kidneys, your liver, your heart. But you see it on the skin because it is the most external. But if you cut your liver, say, for example, it will leave a scar. If you cut muscle, it will leave a scar. It's muscle tissue that healed there, but it's laid down differently. But the point is, you did heal, but it left a mark. It left a scar. Now, scars aren't necessarily bad things. When Jesus came back after being tortured and crucified, he came back with scars, did he not? I mean, even when he went back and got his resurrected body, do you not think he could have just come back perfect again? Yes, he could have done that easily. Could have come back perfect. But he chose to come back with scars. So it's kind of like a trivia question, because when it talks about us getting our perfect bodies, who's going to be the one up there that's scarred? Jesus. We may likely have completely perfect, unblemished, beautiful in our prime bodies. But Jesus chose the scars. It's a reminder of what he's done, what he did for us. He came back. Those scars showed that doubting Thomas. Remember, he put his fingers in places and hands, felt the scars and the wounds. So scars aren't necessarily a bad thing. We like to wish them away and wish they weren't there. The affliction that you have, whatever it is, you might wish it away and wish it wasn't there. But realize that that's a blessing. That's a gift. You're still moving. You're still breathing. You can still do things for the Lord. You can still enjoy life. Don't limit yourself. Yep. Scars aren't always necessarily a bad thing. It shows God's healing and work in your life, but it can be a reminder of his glory also. So to ask the question, what prevents us from going to God sooner and avoiding these scars and afflictions? What prevents us from going to God sooner? Pride, yeah. Yeah, pride. We give ourselves way too much credit. We do a lot in so many situations. Yep, good old pride to start with. And of course, that can be broken down into trying to be self-sufficient, not rebelling against authority, not recognizing God's sovereignty and authority, that it's all His stuff. And of course, finally, it asks a question, what would you say is the primary weakness that stands between us and a full encounter with God? Besides pride now, let's break it down a bit. What would you say are some of the primary weaknesses that stand between us and a full encounter with God? These are kind of common sense. I gave me 3 examples. One was failing to recognize the voice of God when He speaks to you. Why would you do that? Fail to recognize His voice?
Because He's not saying what you want to hear.
That's true too. Yeah, He's saying, come here, and you don't want to go over there. Nope, 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 nope. Because Jesus said, my sheep know me. They recognize my voice. You obviously aren't paying attention to the shepherd, are you? Or like you said, you don't want to go over there. You don't like what it's saying. The next one is relying on your own strengths instead of Him. And we do applaud self-sufficiency. I'm not saying we need to be good stewards, taking care of our houses, our finances, and I'm not saying anything to do with that. You are to be, in a sense, self-sufficient, but realize who gives you everything, that you're not doing it because you're so fantastic. Stay humble.
We're waiting until we screw things up enough. The guy at work just this week was
It's
telling
funny.
me something about working on his car,
Yeah.
and it just kept getting worse and worse. And then he finally had to take it to the mechanic.
That's usually what happens, isn't it? I've seen people in carpentry work too, start a job or start some project at home, a do-it-yourselfer, and just have it all jacked up. And that's when they finally call you in, and you're just like, what in the world? You're looking around. Yeah. Yep. And then the third one is refusing to give in to God rather than your own choices. You will still stick to your own choices and you won't give in to God. That's just stubbornness, pride. Refusing to give in to God rather than your own choices. Yep, so this week, try to recognize God's call and voice in your life. He speaks to you. Try to find a quiet moment. Just say, Lord, here I am. Is there something you want? And then tell the good Lord, not my will, but yours. Start the day asking, Lord, what can I do for you? How can I glorify you today? Just something as simple as that. Lord, what can I do for you with this day? What can I do for you today to glorify you? Just simple. And it really starts your day off in a very good fashion. If you were thinking of some flim-flam, stinking thinking, junk, whatever, when you think of that, it arrests the other thoughts. Lord, what can I do for you today? How can I glorify you? That sets you on a much better path. So a lot of times when we get up, our brains can just automatically, like a broken record, click, 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 go right to some gunk and junk. But set your day straight. What can I do for you today? How can I glorify you, good Lord? All right, that's it for today. Any thoughts or comments? Any questions? That was a good lesson today, the Power Grab Part 2. All right, let's go ahead and close in prayer. Our beloved Father in heaven, thank you for being so gracious and merciful, for providing us with your inspired word. Again, making sure it made it down through the generations, thousands of years, and it's hit our eyes, our ears, our minds. So we just thank you so much for this. Please bless us. Let these words and thoughts and things that you wanted us to learn today, let them go through our ears, into our minds, and then down to our hearts to hit fertile soil there, to really grab a hold and grow. For a lot of times we know the right things to do, but the application or obedience could be lacking. So please help us with that, with our obedience. What can we do for you today, Lord? How can we glorify you? Not our will, but yours. Please bless Pastor Bob as he gives the sermon today. Help us to enjoy this worship experience, but let it be pleasing to you. Please bless John Trotter and Jeanette Trotter as they are on their sabbatical. You give special gifts, Lord. The gifts of prophecy, teaching, evangelism, shepherding, encouragement, giving. You give so many gifts, and there are categories for so many people. John is in his unique category. John Trotter is a pastor of our church. So we ask for your blessings upon him on the sabbatical. But in another very important category is the pastor's spouse, the support for that pastor. That at times would be a tougher job than just being the pastor itself. So bless them both to healing and refreshment, to rejuvenation. Things that are going on in their lives, help that to be resolved. Bless those around them. Do not let Satan run around and cause chaos, discontentment, problems. Please help them, Lord, as they go through the sabbatical experience, to come back refreshed and rejuvenated, just full of love for you and then the people. We ask this in your holy Son's name, in Jesus Christ's name. Amen. All right, we have about a half hour of music, and then played by Brother Jay today. Jay and Dan are back there. God bless them. Thank you for joining us at Living Well.